His wife was dying, and her final request was a promise: marry the woman everyone else had thrown away. She was the town outcast, marked by a scar and a past no one would forgive. He was a respected cattleman, bound by a vow made in a room heavy with grief. What happened after he kept that promise would unravel a secret his wife took to her grave and redefine every idea of love he thought he knew. This is the story of John Harlow, a man who built his life on the solid ground of respect, and Elara Vance, a woman whose name was synonymous with shame in the town of Cedar Ridge. Their union, born from a whispered promise, defied every convention. To understand the scandal that would unfold, you must first see the world they were forced to navigate, a world where grief writes contracts and society holds the pen. But what his wife knew, what she saw in the outcast that no one else did, would turn a simple act of duty into the most dangerous revelation of his life. Cedar Ridge, 1887, a town carved from stubborn rock and even more stubborn people. John Harlow's ranch lay just west of the main street, 400 acres of good grass and a timber frame house that spoke of careful prosperity. He had built it with his wife, Elena, over 15 years. She was the town's schoolmom before she married him, known for her kindness as much as he was known for his fairness. Their life was a portrait of quiet respectability. Then the cough started. A dry, persistent rattle that the doctor from El Paso called consumption. Within a year, the vibrant woman who could quote Shakespeare and break a wild colt was reduced to a whisper in a sunlit room. While John watched his world contract to the four walls of a sick room, Elara Vance lived in the shadow of the ridge itself. Her cabin was a mile from town, tucked against a sandstone cliff. The scar was the first thing people mentioned, a pale, jagged line from her left temple to her jaw, a souvenir from the fire that had claimed her family's homestead and her parents' lives when she was 16. But the second thing they mentioned was the scandal. 2 years after the fire, she had been engaged to Thomas Boyd, the son of the mercantile owner. He broke it off a week before the wedding, telling anyone who would listen that she was cursed and unnatural. After that, she retreated. She traded herbal remedies for supplies, spoke only when necessary, and became a story parents told to keep children from wandering too far. John only knew her by sight and reputation. He'd nod if he passed her on the street, a formality extended to all, but he'd never heard her speak. His world was cattle prices and harvest yields, the growing fear in his chest as Elena grew lighter every day. The doctor's visits stopped. All that was left was waiting. On an afternoon in late September, the aspen leaves just beginning to turn, Elena gripped his hand. Her voice was a thread of sound. "John, promise me something." He leaned close, his throat tight. "Anything." She took a labored breath. "You will be so lonely. The children, they need a mother's heart, not just a housekeeper." He started to protest, to say he could never replace her, but she pressed his hand with a surprising strength. "Listen, promise me you will marry Elara Vance." The name hit the quiet room like a stone through glass. John pulled back, sure the fever was talking. "Elena, you can't mean that. The Vance woman, the town is wrong," she whispered, her eyes fierce. "I have watched her for years. She is strong. She is kind beneath the fear. She will love this land and she will understand you." Tears tracked through the hollows of her cheeks. "Promise me, John, not for you, for our children, for the life we built. It must not go to someone soft." He was trapped. To refuse a dying wish was unthinkable. To agree felt like a betrayal of everything, even of the woman asking it. With a heart splitting in two, he said the words, "I promise." Elena died at dawn 3 days later. The funeral was the largest Cedar Ridge had ever seen. John stood stone-faced through the hymns and handshakes, the promise echoing in his skull like a curse. For a month he did nothing. He threw himself into work, rising before light, collapsing after dark. His 3 children, James, 12, Sarah, 9, and little Benjamin, just 5, became shadows in their own home, cared for by a rotation of pitying neighbor women. The silence in the house was a physical weight. And every day, the promise tightened around him. He finally rode out to Elara's cabin on a cold October morning, frost silvering the grass. She was in her meager garden, digging up roots. She froze when she saw him, her posture turning defensive, one hand rising instinctively toward her scarred cheek. He dismounted, hat in hand, feeling more a fool than he ever had. He stated his business bluntly, a transaction laid bare, his wife's wish, a need for a mother in his home, a marriage in name with respect and a roof offered. Expected refusal or perhaps a bitter laugh. She studied him for a long minute, her eyes the color of river slate. Why, she asked, the simplest, most impossible question. I gave my word, he said, the only truth he had left. She looked past him toward the distant smoke of town, then down at her own rough, soil-stained hands. They will hate you for it, she said softly. He nodded. I know. Another pause filled with the cry of a hawk. All right, she said, no emotion in her voice. I will come on Saturday. Word spread through Cedar Ridge like a grass fire. The respected John Harlow marrying the Vance curse. It was an obscenity. Men clapped him on the back with too much force, asking if he'd lost his mind with grief. Women averted their eyes, whispering behind their hands about the children being exposed to God knows what. The minister, a stern man named Pritchard, reluctantly agreed to perform the ceremony at the ranch, refusing to sanctify it in his church. The wedding was a hollow affair. Ilara arrived in a plain, dark dress, her hair pulled tightly back. No family sat with her. John's children stood stiffly beside him, confused and afraid. They exchanged vows in front of the fireplace. Her hand was ice-cold in his. When Pritchard pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss. Only a collective, judgmental silence from the handful of witnesses. He brought her to the house, showed her the small room that would be hers, separate from his. The children stared from the hallway. That first night, as John lay awake in his own bed, he heard the faint, muffled sound of crying through the wall. It wasn't the crying of a schemer or a wicked woman. It was the sound of absolute, bewildered despair. And in that moment, John Harlow was certain he had not just broken his promise to the dead, but had doomed the living in his care. He had brought a ghost into his home, and now they would all have to live with the haunting. But what he didn't hear, what he couldn't possibly know yet, was that in her room, Ilara Vance had stopped crying. She had wiped her face, opened the small satchel she brought, and pulled out a sealed letter addressed in a familiar, graceful hand, Elena Harlow's handwriting, and she began to read. The letter was not long, but each sentence was a key turning in a lock Ilara thought had rusted shut. My dear Ilara, it began, if you are reading this, I am gone, and John has kept his promise. Please do not hate him. He is a good man, trapped by his word to a dying woman. And please do not hate me. Ilara's breath caught. Elena described watching her for years, seeing her tend injured birds near the creek, how she always paid her tab at the mercantile on time, even when it meant going hungry. The town calls you cursed, but I have seen your hands heal a foal with a broken leg. I have seen you leave baskets of herbs on the porches of the sick, too proud to take credit. My children need that kind of quiet strength. They need someone who knows how to survive a world that is not kind. John needs to remember that love is not a parade. It is the daily bread of seeing someone truly and choosing to stay. The letter ended with a plea, teach him. He has forgotten how to listen to anything but the wind and his own grief, and let him teach you that not all walls are meant to keep you in. Some are meant to keep the storm out. Ilara folded the letter, her hands steady now. The bewildered despair was gone, replaced by a sharp, clear purpose. Elena Harlow had not chosen her out of pity or madness. She had chosen her as a successor. The next morning, Ilara rose before dawn. She found the kitchen cold, the remains of last night's supper still on the table. She set to work. She did not try to charm the children. When James, the eldest, scowled at the porridge she made, saying it was lumpy, she simply nodded. It is, she agreed. I'll do better tomorrow. She didn't flinch when Sarah asked, her voice small, Are you our new mama? Ilara met her gaze. I am Ilara, I am here to help. That is all for now. It was an honesty the child seemed to understand. John watched this with a growing sense of unease. He had expected weeping or sullen silence, or perhaps a clumsy attempt to buy affection. He did not expect this calm, relentless competence. She cleaned the house not with a show of subservience, but with the efficient movements of someone making a space habitable. She asked him for a list of the children's routines, their likes and fears. When he gave it to her, gruff and short, she studied it as if it were a map. A week after her arrival, little Benjamin woke screaming from a nightmare. John, stumbling from his room, found Ilara already there. She wasn't cooing or singing. She was sitting on the edge of his bed, speaking in a low, factual tone about the constellations visible through his window, naming them one by one. That's Orion. He's a hunter, but he's very far away. He can't get in here. The boy's sobs subsided into hiccups, then into sleep. John retreated, feeling like an intruder. The first real test came from the town. A week later, John needed supplies. He hitched the wagon, expecting Ilara to stay behind, hidden. As he walked out, she appeared on the porch, wearing a simple bonnet that shaded her scar. I will come, she stated. It wasn't a request. The ride to Cedar Ridge was silent. the tension thick enough to taste. On the main street, the silence became a staring, heavy thing. Women gathered in clusters, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. Ilara kept her head level, her eyes forward. John felt a hot spike of shame, not for her, but for himself, for caring what they thought. At the Mercantile, Thomas Boyd, her former fiancé, was behind the counter. His smirk was an ugly thing. "Well, John, heard you got yourself new stock." He looked Ilara up and down. "Hope she's more useful to you than she was to me." The air left the room. John felt a red rage heat his neck, but before he could speak, Ilara did. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "My account is settled, Mr. Boyd, is yours." She held his gaze until he looked away, muttering about the price of nails. John paid for the goods, his hand trembling slightly. On the way out, passing a group of men, he heard one, a rancher named Dobbs, say just loud enough, "Hard up enough to marry a haunted piece of glass." Grief must have cooked his brain. Something in John snapped. He stopped, turned, and faced Dobbs. "You have something to say about my wife, Jade? Say it to me." The street went utterly quiet. Dobbs, a bulky man, puffed up. "I said it's a sad day when a man can't tell good stock from bad." John took one step forward. He didn't raise his voice. "Ilara Vance is my wife. The next word any man says against her, he'll say to me, and we'll settle it." It wasn't a brawl, it was a declaration. He turned, offered his arm to Ilara. After a heartbeat of stunned silence, she took it. They walked back to the wagon together, the eyes of the town burning into their backs. He had not defended her out of love, but out of a furious, primal defense of his own choice. But the effect was the same. That night, for the first time, Ilara spoke to him without being spoken to first. He was on the porch, staring at the stars. She stepped out, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He took the cup. "Yes, I did." He sipped the coffee. It was perfect, strong, no sugar, just how he liked it. He hadn't told her. She had learned. He looked at her then, really looked. The scar was there, yes, but in the moonlight, her face was all sharp, intelligent angles and watchful eyes. "What was in that letter?" he asked, the question escaping him. She didn't smile. "A friend saw me," she said simply, "and she trusted you to do the same." Then she went back inside. The following days were a series of small, silent revolutions. Ilara took Sarah out to identify edible plants. She showed James how to bind a book that had fallen apart. She let Benjamin help her knead bread, her hands patiently guiding his flour-covered fists. She did not try to replace Alina. She built something new quietly, in the spaces grief had left empty. John found himself watching her, not with suspicion, but with a dawning, uncomfortable curiosity. He saw the way her hands could be gentle with a splinter in Sarah's finger, then ruthlessly efficient dressing a wound on a steer. He saw her reading Alina's old books by the fire, her finger tracing the words. Then the drought began, the spring rains never came. The creek by the north pasture shrank to a trickle, the grass browned. Anxiety was a constant hum in the house. John worked longer, harder, coming home with dust ground into the lines of his face. One evening, exhausted, he mentioned offhand that he'd have to sell off 1/3 of the herd early for a terrible price or watch them starve. Ilara, who was mending a shirt, put her needle down. "The old Miller place," she said. He looked up, confused. The Miller homestead had been abandoned for a decade. Its well was said to have gone dry. "What about it?" "The well isn't dry," she said. "It's deep. The water is there, but the pump mechanism is broken. I used to go there for solitude." John shook his head. "Even if you're right, fixing it would take tools, time I don't have. The children and I can handle the home stock for 2 days," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You take 2 hands and go." It was a gamble. 2 days of lost labor on a fool's hope. He looked at her calm, certain face, and for the first time, he made a decision not based on duty or promise, but on a thread of faith. "All right," he said. He returned 2 days later, covered in grime, his hands blistered, but his eyes were alive. "You were right," he said, the words a revelation. "The water's there, cold and clear. We got the pump working." He hadn't just saved his herd, he had secured his ranch's future through the knowledge of the town outcast. That night, he didn't retreat to his room. He sat at the table while she worked. "How did you know?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "After the fire, after Thomas. I spent a lot of time alone. I learned to listen to the land. It tells you things if you're quiet enough to hear." John Harlow, a man who had always believed land was something you worked and conquered, felt a shift in his understanding. She wasn't cursed by the land, she was in conversation with it. This fragile growing understanding was shattered 3 days later. A rider came pounding up to the ranch, one of Dobbs's men. He didn't dismount, just yelled toward the house. "Harlow, there's been a rockslide on the North Pass. Your boy James was up there checking fences. He's trapped, and his leg's bad. We can't get him loose." John's world narrowed to a single, terrifying point. He ran for his horse, his mind racing with images of crushing stone. As he threw a saddle on, Ilara ran from the house, a leather satchel in her hand. She went not to the rider, but to the work shed, emerging with a heavy iron bar and a coil of rope. She looked at John, her face pale but set. "I'm coming, I know that pass, and you'll need someone who knows how to set a bone." There was no time to argue. He nodded, and she mounted the spare horse beside him, riding astride in her plain dress like she was born to it. As they galloped toward the rising dust in the distance, John Harlow realized two things. His child's life was in danger, and the only person he wanted by his side was the woman he had married for all the wrong reasons. The real reason Elena had chosen her was about to be revealed in the most brutal way possible, and it had nothing to do with herbs or quiet strength, and everything to do with a secret buried in the scars of the past. The North Pass was a jagged wound in the earth, dust still hanging in the air where the cliff face had sheared away. 3 men from Dobbs's crew stood uselessly, staring at a pile of rubble where a section of the old fence had been. From within the pile, they could hear James's weak, pain-tight voice. "Pa," John scrambled over the rocks, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could see his son's face, pale and streaked with dirt, his torso and one arm free. The rest of him was buried under a slab of limestone and a tangle of smaller rocks. A rusty fence post was pinned across his legs. "I'm here, son, I'm right here." John's hands scrabbled at the rocks, but the main slab was immense. He couldn't budge it. Ilara slid down beside him, her satchel over her shoulder. She didn't look at the trapped boy first. She looked at the rock formation, her eyes tracing lines of fracture. "You," she said, pointing to the biggest of Dobbs's men, "get that rope around the top of that slab. Tie it off to the saddle horn of my horse. You two start clearing the shale from this side, but do not touch the post." Her voice was calm, authoritative. The men, stunned, hesitated for a second before moving to obey. John stared at her. This wasn't the quiet, guarded woman from the cabin. This was a commander on a battlefield. Ilara, his legs. "I see it," she cut him off, her tone clinical. She crouched, peering into the gap. "James, look at me." The boy's terrified eyes found hers. "My name is Ilara, your leg is pinned. It will hurt more before it gets better. You must be very still and very brave. Can you do that?" James, choking back a sob, gave a jerky nod. She reached into her satchel, pulling out a small bottle and a clean cloth. "This will smell sharp. Breathe it in. It will help the pain." She soaked the cloth and placed it near his face. The smell of wintergreen and something herbal filled the dusty air. James's eyelids fluttered. She turned to John. "The large rock must be lifted just enough for me to pull him free. The post is likely the only thing keeping the smaller rubble from crushing him further. When the rock moves, the post will shift. I will have seconds." John nodded, the world narrowing to her instructions. He helped secure the rope. On her signal, he urged the horse forward. The rope went taut, creaking. The massive slab groaned, lifting an inch, then 2. Dust and pebbles rained down. "Now," Ilara shouted. As the space widened, she plunged into the gap, ignoring the shifting gravel. She wrapped both arms around James's torso. With a raw, guttural sound of effort, she pulled. He came free in a shower of dirt just as the fence post twisted and the smaller rocks collapsed into the space he had occupied. They tumbled back onto the cleared ground, James crying out as his injured leg was jostled. Ilara immediately laid him flat, her hands running down his leg with expert precision. She felt the break through his torn trousers above the knee. Her face was grim. "It's a bad break, clean, but the bone is pressing. It must be set now before the swelling traps it." She looked at John, her eyes holding his. "I need you to hold him. He will fight. You must not let him move." John moved to hold his son's shoulders. The other men looked on, silenced by the brutal efficiency of the rescue. Ilara took a deep breath, her hands positioning themselves on James's leg. "James, on the count of 3, she said, her voice softening for just a moment. Then she pulled, a sharp, precise motion accompanied by a sickening crunch. James screamed, his body arching against his father's hold, then went limp, passing out from the pain. Ilara didn't pause. She pulled wooden splints and bandages from her satchel, immobilizing the leg with swift, sure wraps. Her hands were steady, but John saw the sheen of sweat on her brow. When she finished, She sat back on her heels, breathing heavily. Only then did she seem to notice the blood on her own hands, scraped raw from the rocks. The ride back was a slow, nightmare procession. James, unconscious, was secured in the back of a wagon. John drove, Ilara sitting beside him, cradling her injured hands in her lap. The Dobbs men rode ahead, their earlier mockery replaced by a stunned, respectful silence. One of them, an older hand named Sealers, tipped his hat to Ilara as they parted ways at the ranch. "Ma'am," was all he said, but it carried the weight of an apology. For 3 days, James drifted in and out of fevered sleep. Ilara barely left his side. She administered willow bark tea, changed poultices made from comfrey and honey from her own stores, and kept the leg elevated. John watched her move through the sick room with the same quiet certainty she had shown in the past. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. James woke, clear-eyed, and asked for water. The crisis had passed. It was that evening, with James sleeping peacefully, that John found Ilara on the back porch, staring at her bandaged hands. He brought her a cup of tea. "You saved his life," he said, the words inadequate. She took the cup. "Elena's letter," she began, not looking at him. "She said I knew how to survive a world that is not kind. She didn't know the half of it." She took a shaky breath. "The fire that killed my family, it wasn't an accident." John went still. The story everyone knew was a lantern knocked over in a storm. "My father wasn't just a homesteader," she said, her voice flat. "He was a doctor back east. He came west for my mother's health, but he kept practicing. He treated miners, trappers, natives, anyone who came. He didn't ask for money, just trade. A man came, a miner from a claim up in the mountains. His wound was gangrenous. My father told him the leg had to come off to save his life. The man refused. He died 2 days later in our barn, cursing my father's name." She sipped the tea, her hand trembling slightly. "A week after we buried him, his brother and 2 others came. They were drunk, raging. They said my father had murdered him for the gold in his pocket. There was no gold. They barred the doors and set the house on fire." John felt the blood drain from his face. "Ilara. My father got my mother and my little brother out a back window. He pushed me out after them. He turned to go back for his medical bag, his books." Her voice fractured. "The roof fell in. I was running toward the house when a burning timber swung down and caught me across the face." She touched her scar through the fabric of her dress. "I woke up 3 days later in a native camp further down the valley. A hunting party had found me. They treated my burns. By the time I was well enough to return, there was nothing but ash and rumors. The men who did it told the town my father was experimenting with chemicals. They said the scar was God's mark on me for his sins. And the town chose the easier story." The weight of her truth settled over John, crushing in its injustice. Her isolation, Thomas Boyd's rejection, it wasn't superstition. It was a cover-up for murder, and she had borne the blame for it alone for over a decade. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" he whispered. Who would have believed the word of a scarred, half-starved girl against 3 established men? She finally looked at him, her eyes hollow with the memory. "That's why I knew about the Miller well. I hid there afterwards. That's how I know how to set a bone and fight a fever. It was all I had left of him." She wrapped her arms around herself. Elena, she was the only one who ever looked past the scar and saw the person hiding behind it. She saw my father's hands in mine. In that moment, John Harlow didn't see the town outcast. He saw a woman of immense courage, a living monument to a terrible crime the world had chosen to ignore. The promise he had made felt different now. It wasn't a chain. It was a bridge he had blindly crossed, leading him to a truth everyone else was too cowardly to face. He reached out, his calloused hand covering her bandaged one. He didn't have words. The gesture was enough. Word of the rescue, of Ilara's skill and calm under pressure, spread through Cedar Ridge with a different tone. The story told by Dobbs's men had none of the old scorn. It was a story of decisive action and medical knowledge. People began to remember the herbal baskets left on porches, the injured animals that had healed. A subtle shift occurred. When John went to town the next week, the stares were curious, not hostile. Mrs. Dobbs, Jade's wife, even nodded to him from her wagon. The wall of rejection was cracking. But a new storm was gathering. The drought tightened its fist. The water from the Miller well was a reprieve, not a solution. The sky remained a relentless, cloudless blue. The creek bed was now just baked mud. Ranchers started selling herds for pennies. Tension simmered, ready to boil over into desperation. And on a scorching afternoon, a well-dressed stranger arrived in a polished buggy, asking for John Harlow. He represented a cattle consortium from Denver. He made an offer for John's land, a generous one, citing the drought as a reason to cut losses. John refused. The land was his life, and now it was Ilara's sanctuary. The stranger left, but his words lingered. Think on it, Mr. Harlow. This drought breaks men. It's not a matter of if you'll sell, but when and for how much less. That night John walked the fence line, the weight of the ranch, his children, and the woman sleeping in his house pressing down on him. He realized with a jolt that his thoughts, his fears, his hopes for the future all included Ilara. The duty had transformed into a deep, abiding respect, and something else, something warmer and more terrifying. He was falling in love with his wife, and the guilt that came with that realization was a new kind of prison. He had promised Elena to marry her, but loving her felt like a betrayal of the woman he had vowed to love forever. He stood under the vast, indifferent stars, trapped between a promise to the dead and the beating of his own living heart, while the land itself threatened to crumble beneath his feet. The real conflict was no longer with the town. It was within himself, and the choice he made now would define every day that came after. Guilt is a quiet poison, and for weeks, John let it seep into every thought of Ilara. He found himself pulling away, speaking only of chores, retreating into a shell of duty. She noticed, of course. Her own quiet grew more pronounced, a wall of uncertainty rebuilding between them. The drought became their only shared language, a relentless enemy that demanded every ounce of their energy. They worked side by side under the brutal sun, moving the remaining cattle to the last green pasture near the Miller well, their communication reduced to gestures and necessity. The breaking point came from an unexpected place. Sarah, who had been watching everything with a child's sharp eyes, approached Ilara as she was patching a worn saddle in the barn. "Why is Pa sad at you?" she asked, her small face serious. Ilara paused, the needle in her hand. "He's not sad at me, Sarah. He's sad about a lot of things." The girl shook her head. "He looks at you like he did at Mama's picture sometimes, but then he gets all stiff and goes away." The simple observation was a dagger. That evening, John found Ilara waiting for him in the kitchen after the children were asleep. Her expression was resolute. "We need to talk." She didn't sit. "You are punishing yourself for feeling something for me," she said, her voice low but clear. "You think loving me betrays Elena. I see it in every glance you cut short, every step you take away." John opened his mouth to deny it, but no words came. He just stared at the rough wood of the table. "She did not send me here to be a ghost in your house, John," Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength. "She sent me here to live. And so did I. I walked into this knowing it was a transaction, but I stayed because I found a home. I found children who look at me and see a person, not a story. I found a man who defended me before he even knew me." She took a step closer. "Elena's greatest gift to you wasn't my hands or my knowledge. It was the chance to love again without the terrible weight of choosing. She chose for you so you could be free to simply feel." John looked up, his eyes raw. "It feels like forgetting her." "Loving me doesn't erase her," Ilara said softly. "It honors her. It proves her last act on this earth was one of profound wisdom, not grief-stricken madness. She trusted you to see what she saw, do you?" The question hung in the air, the only sound the crackle of the dying fire. John stood up. He didn't reach for her. He walked to the mantel, to the small portrait of Elena. He looked at his first wife's gentle smile, and for the first time he didn't feel the wrenching pull of loss. He felt a deep, abiding gratitude. He turned back to Ilara. "I see you," he said, the words finally breaking free. "I have for a long time." He crossed the room, stopping an arm's length away. "And it terrifies me." A faint, real smile touched Ilara's lips. "It terrifies me too." He closed the distance then, not with a kiss, but by taking her scarred, work-worn hand in both of his. It was a conscious claiming, a choice made in the full light of truth. The guilt did not vanish, but it receded, replaced by a startling, solid joy. The drought, however, showed no such mercy. The well at the Miller place began to yield less. The verdant patch around it shrank daily. The cattle consortium man returned, his offer lower now, smelling blood in the water. John sent him away again, but the man's smirk promised he would be back. The entire valley was parched, desperate. Fights broke out over water rights at the county line. A ranch to the east burned to the ground from a lightning strike, the fire consuming what little feed was left. It was Ilara who proposed the impossible. She had been studying the old maps in her father's medical books, cross-referencing them with tales she'd heard from the native hunters years before. "There's a spring," she told John one night, "high up in the canyon, in a box canyon my father called the Stone Cup, the old maps mark it. The hunters said it never runs dry, but the path is gone, washed out in a flood." John was skeptical. A mythical spring was a fairy tale for dying men. But he had learned to trust her knowledge of the land. They assembled what gear they could spare, ropes, picks, canvas bags, and set out at first light, telling the children they were checking the high line. The climb was brutal. The old trail was indeed gone, leaving only scree slopes and sheer rock faces. They inched upward, the sun a hammer on their backs. After 6 hours, John's water was gone. His hope was fading. Just as he was about to suggest turning back, Ilara, who was scouting ahead, let out a sharp cry, not of pain, but of discovery. He scrambled up to a narrow ledge where she stood, pointing into a shadowed cleft in the canyon wall. There, in a bowl of solid rock, was a pool of water, so clear and still it looked like a piece of the sky had fallen. Ferns clung to the damp stone around it. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth. They drank like animals, the water so cold it made their teeth ache. It was the sweetest thing John had ever tasted. They filled every container they had, but the problem remained: how to get the water down to the ranch. The spring was inaccessible to cattle, too high and too confined. As they sat by the pool, Ilara traced the rock face with her eyes. "Gravity," she said. "We can't bring the herd to the water. We have to bring the water to the herd." Her plan was audacious. They would use the canvas and the few spare pipes from an old windmill project to create a crude siphon, a vein running down the mountain to a new dug trough in the high pasture. It was a race against evaporation and their own exhaustion. They worked for 2 days, John hacking a narrow channel in the rock, Ilara sealing joints with pine pitch and strips of cloth. When they finally released the water from the spring pool, it was a trickle, not a flow. But it was a constant, unwavering trickle that began to fill the new trough below. It wasn't enough to save the whole herd, but it was enough to save the breeding stock, the heart of the ranch. As they watched the first water spill over the trough's edge, John put his arm around Ilara's shoulders, pulling her close. They had done the impossible together. News of their success, of the Harlow Spring, traveled fast. It wasn't viewed with jealousy, but with a desperate communal hope. Jade Dobbs himself, humbled and facing total ruin, rode up to ask, hat in hand, if John might show his men the way. John looked at Ilara. She gave a single nod. The next day, John and Dobbs led a group of ranchers up the difficult path. They shared the location, not the water itself, but the knowledge that it existed. It was an act of peace that reshaped the community. The Vance curse, WOS Chinese letter forgotten, replaced by stories of the Vance Spring. One evening, as autumn finally brought a hint of coolness and the first miraculous rains, John and Ilara sat on the porch. The children were inside, James walking with only a slight limp. John spoke without looking at her. "The Minister Pritchard was in town today. He mentioned that our marriage was performed under duress, that if we wanted to, we could have it properly blessed in the church, as a real marriage." He let the words settle. "I told him we would think on it." Ilara was quiet for a long time. "Do you need a church to tell you what this is?" she asked, gesturing between them and toward the house full of sleeping children. "No," John said, "but I would like to stand in front of those people with you, not as a man keeping a promise, but as a man making one, to you, by choice." She took his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "Then we will." They were married again in the Cedar Ridge Church on a bright October Sunday. This time the pews were full. Sealers from Dobbs's crew was there. Mrs. Dobbs brought a pie. Even Thomas Boyd nodded from the back, his expression unreadable but not hostile. Sarah and Benjamin scattered wildflowers on the aisle. James stood as John's best man. When John kissed his bride, the scar on her cheek lifted with her smile, and no one looked away. Years later, long after the drought was a memory and the railroad had bypassed Cedar Ridge, John and Ilara sat on that same porch, watching their grandchildren chase fireflies in the yard. The ranch had thrived, expanded even, watered by the forever spring and their joint resilience. Ilara's garden was legendary, a lush, chaotic testament to life. As the evening deepened, Ilara reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a faded, folded paper. She handed it to John. "I found this tucked in one of Alina's books last week. I think it was meant for you." John unfolded it with careful hands. It was Elena's handwriting, but just a fragment, a line that had never been part of Ilara's letter. My dearest John, if you are reading this, you have looked past the scar and seen the lighthouse. Do not be afraid of the new light. A heart that has loved deeply does not have less to give. It has learned how to hold more. Love her without shadow. It is the only way to honor the love we had, by proving it taught you how to love again. John read it twice, his vision blurring. He looked at Ilara, his wife in every sense, the woman who had built a life with him from the ashes of two broken pasts. He had kept his dying wife's promise, and in doing so, had been given everything. The story that began with an end became a testament to a simple, enduring truth. Sometimes, the most profound love is not the first you choose, but the second you are wise enough to recognize. The story of John and Ilara Harlow is more than a tale of a kept promise. It is a map of how love can arrive in the most unexpected packaging, not as a first choice, but as a last request, and flourish not in spite of hardship, but because of it. We are drawn to such stories because they defy the simple arithmetic of the heart. They ask the uncomfortable question, what treasures do we dismiss in others because we are too busy reading the labels society has pasted upon them? Elena Harlow's dying wish was an act of radical insight. She saw the strength in the scarred, the resilience in the rejected, and she entrusted her most precious legacy not to a conventional choice, but to the one person who understood the value of a safe harbor because she had been forever adrift. This narrative echoes far beyond the fences of a ranch in Cedar Ridge. It touches on the universal human experience of second chances, of rebuilding after loss, and of the quiet courage required to accept a love that doesn't look the way you thought it would. Statistics tell us that remarriage after loss is common, yet those unions carry their own unique weight of memory and comparison. The success of such a bond often hinges not on forgetting the past, but on weaving its threads into a new, stronger fabric. John's journey from duty to devotion is a masterclass in that delicate alchemy. So what became of the town that once shunned her? Cedar Ridge, like many small communities, adapted. The myth of the curse was replaced by the legend of the healer, the savior of the high pasture, the woman who found the spring. But the deeper lesson isn't about changing a town's mind. It's about the power of two people creating a world so solid and true within their own walls that the opinions outside them simply cease to matter. They built a kingdom of mutual respect on a foundation laid by a promise, and in doing so, they proved that the most enduring legacies are often born from the most improbable beginnings. The next time you hear a story that begins with an ending, remember the Harlows. Remember that a closed door is not always a finality. Sometimes it is the necessary pressure that forces a window to swing wide open, revealing a vista you never dreamed was there. The greatest loves are not always the ones we chase, but the ones we are wise enough to recognize when they are gently placed before us. If you found meaning in this story of promises kept and love discovered in the unlikeliest of places, consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue to unearth these hidden chapters of the human heart. Thank you for